Flower gets to talk first, and Jason, and Questa, and Ronnie, and Rachel. Okay? We always try to do this in the fairest possible manner, and we want to make sure that the stakeholders get a chance to interact with the candidates. So,
Well, LA Eco Village on the ground in this location was established in January 1st, 1993. After about 10 years of planning, much of that time planning for another site about 7 miles from here that was an old city-owned landfill on 11 acres. And it seemed very rural, even though it was still very much part of the city. We were able to use that site. We have a fabulous volunteer architect that had put together a 50-page feasibility study. We had done a lot of advocacy in City Hall and actually got the idea of the Eco Village written into the city's housing element, which is part of the general plan for the city. It said, yes, there will be, we didn't have the word Eco Village then. There will be a solar ecological village, and it will be supported by the mayor's office and the community development agency and the environmental affairs department and so forth. It was actually written in as public policy. So we were very proud. Thought, oh wow, we've arrived, we're public policy. And of course, anyone that's done public advocacy work knows that as long as you're fairly well organized, articulate, and find yourself in the right place at the right time with the right people, getting public policy is not all that hard. Getting a regulation is a bit harder, and getting funding is even a bit harder, and getting accountability for that funding is harder still. So we only went the first step on that sort of thing. Now, why did we do it? Why were we wanting to create something called an ecological solar village before there was the word eco village, or even before the word sustainability came into common use, which was not until 1989, and we started working on this site around the mid-'80s. My organization, CRSP, standing for Cooperative Resources and Services Project, as its public interest purpose, is a training and education center for the development of cooperatives of all kinds. And so therefore, goodness gracious, here in Los Angeles, the great 435 square mile city of Los Angeles, we have spread throughout that area. Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we had worker co-ops here, food co-ops over there, we had child care co-ops over here, housing co-ops over there. We had co-ops spread throughout the city. Not all that prolific, but I knew about them when I started this organization in 1980. And why don't we have a cooperative neighborhood where all of the co-op activity comes together in a geographically bound, walkable area? So that was the idea for why start a sustainable neighborhood, or an eco-village, or an ecological urban village. That was what it was that we were aiming for even then, and found that site after scouting the central city for quite a while, and found that we could work with that site, even though we were very naive. It was not a good site for an eco-village, but it was a good site for bringing people together, doing planning, learning a lot, getting public policy in place, meeting a lot of people throughout the city, and in the various city departments that we would have to work with. So it served its purpose well. It wasn't until after the 1992 riots, or civil unrest, that that Los Angeles went up in flames as a result of the Rodney King decision not to hold the Los Angeles police officers responsible who had brutally beaten Rodney King. And that was essentially the first time that something like that had been videoed and gone viral. And of course, since that time, we know that we haven't come near solving that problem. That's a whole other issue. But it was those fires throughout this section of Los Angeles and south of us and west of us, where there were fires all over the city, and where we are in this building right now, adjacent to us, there was a 2-story commercial structure that burned to the ground, just, kind of smoldered for 3 days. There was a print shop, a photo development lab, and a dry cleaners. And I know, I lived across the street at the time, but I know I never breathed the same. But there were five significant fires within 2 blocks of where we're sitting right now. And so that weekend, people were either leaving the city in droves or planning to, or coming into the city to help sweep up and clean up. And what I did is I sat at my computer for 2 days, translating the 50-page feasibility study into 4 pages of bullet points about how could we do this $50 million new construction eco-village that we were planning on this 11-acre site. How could we translate that into the retrofit of a built-out urban, intensely urban neighborhood in such a way that maybe things like that might not happen again if we could demonstrate a different way of living in our city. And that became our vision, to reinvent how we live in the city. And so Monday, our 20-member planning group came together, and for the next 6 months, from the uprisings were in April 1992, so from April, May, until December, we were talking about that at our meetings. At every meeting, we continued to kind of work on the 11-acre site 7 miles from here, but not with a lot of enthusiasm. And there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm in that neighborhood for having us be there. And so on December 11th, 1992, it was enthusiastic and it was unanimous. Let's just do it in Lois's neighborhood. Because, as I said, there were 5 fires here. I had already lived in the neighborhood for 13 years and been holding all kinds of community events and workshops in my very small space here in the neighborhood. And so let's just do it where we have already some kind of a presence. Because what was critically important to me and to many members of that planning committee is that we have to live in the neighborhood where we want this sort of thing to happen. So we can't kind of go live 20 or 30 miles away and drive into a place that you want to make an eco-village every day. You got to live there. You got to be with the people, and especially if it's going to be an urban eco-village, and especially even more so if it's going to be an intensely urban area, which we are. And so it was an easy decision. I was very grateful that that's what our planning committee wanted to do. I didn't have any commitment to this neighborhood, even though I'd lived here for 13 years. And on January 1st, 1993, I made that commitment. And here we are now.
You said earlier that there was a lot of, the lead up to actually owning these buildings and having people live in them, that there was a lot of community engagement work that you did kind of in the lead up to that. Can you describe that process a little bit more?
For the first few years, I was the only person who lived here intentionally, and several members of that planning committee would come in 2 and 3 times a week, and we would walk the neighborhood up and down the streets, meeting people. Mostly it was a scary neighborhood, and people didn't spend a lot of time on the streets. However, we would sometimes, start being playful in the streets. Parents were not too excited about letting their children outside alone. By Earth Day, April 1993, we were already planning a tree planting. So, for example, we would meet parents of children and ask them if it was okay if we had their children come to a little brunch on the sidewalk to talk about what kind of fruit trees we could plant. So we had about 12 kids come to little brunch on the street and ask them what kind of fruit tree they would like to plant. And so on Earth Day 1993, we did that. We planted 4 fruit trees, and the kids, we named them as tree stewards. The kids got to name their tree, and we would do a little ritual around the tree when it was in the ground. They would dig the hole the week before, and with some help, and then we'd get the tree in the ground. Then we'd make a circle, and we'd talk about what are going to be the problems this tree is going to have, and how are you going to help it. And they had little plaques with their tree's name on it and who was the tree steward. So it was really exciting, and then that was kind of the start of something really important. The other thing we had been doing leading up to the April tree planting, when we started walking up and down the block in January, as we'd meet neighbors in a very friendly demeanor, we would introduce ourselves and say what some of our visions were for the neighborhood, and try to learn as much as we could about the neighbors we were meeting on the street. And then when we met other neighbors, we would gossip about the other neighbors we had met, but only positive gossip. And then we would kind of have neighborhood events and flyer the whole neighborhood and tell everyone, come on, bring some food, let's get together as a neighborhood. And then we would introduce them to one another, and with great excitement, oh, this is the person I was telling you about, that blah, blah, blah. And so they would be really enthusiastic about meeting each other. And in 6 months' time, actually in the first time we had a meeting, invited neighbors, and there were not too many that came, of course, only a handful. And then when we asked, what do you think were the strengths and weaknesses of our neighborhood, we never got beyond the first one, which all anyone wanted to talk about was crime, the big C, so to speak. So if we were kind of a conventional community organization, we would immediately have started to organize a neighborhood watch group. But we clearly understood that the fear of crime is much more debilitating than crime itself. And so we, and what we also knew was that oftentimes it's the breakdown of community that creates that kind of fear. So we just figured we should be working on developing community rather than developing a neighborhood watch. Who wants to have a neighborhood watch where the only thing that neighbors talk about is who broke into whose home or whose car or who stole what, or stuff like that? We didn't think was going to be the best thing for creating community. So we just continued to do our community relationship work. 6 months later, we had a similar meeting and asked the same question, and crime came on the 3rd page of our brainstorm list, and it came as an afterthought. That was something we accomplished with essentially zero money and only time and a desire to be friends with our neighbors. Of the 500 people that lived in our neighborhood, we pretty much knew all of the children, what buildings they lived in, who their parents were, and there was just a whole different feeling on the street, and we really did become a neighborhood that was very much a community. It was a wonderful, wonderful time in the development of Eco Village. On the other hand, what we all know is that on average, Americans move once every 5 years. And so those people with whom we formed so many wonderful relationships, there's hardly not any of them left here anymore. And as new people moved into the neighborhood, we had already begun to grow inward because we had bought this 40-unit apartment building that was in near slum-like conditions. The first time we had a building inspection, we had 200 violations, habitability issues. The apartment building was half vacant, and so we had never owned property before, or managed it for that matter. So that inward, getting more and more inward to make what we had habitable, and at the same time trying to make good decisions about who we would allow to move in that could be members of our intentional community. By that time, we actually did have, I think, 3 or 4 more neighbors who had moved into other vacant units on the block, but not in our big building that we had just bought. So we were pretty inwardly focused, and that wonderful, wonderful era of the beginnings of Eco Village kind of grew behind us. And now, 26 years later, we hear a lot of our intentional neighbors wanting very much and acting on their desires to do much more outreach in our existing neighborhood. And many of our neighbors here have become friends with with other neighbors in the neighborhood that are not members of our intentional community. So that is beginning to happen once again.
I grew up in Koreatown, just like a mile from here, and I did not know that this place existed. Just went to college like an hour away from here, studied public policy, and got really interested in urban planning because I learned about the segregation of Los Angeles, and I should say I went to boarding school for high school, so I was really into the super urban, like green areas of like Connecticut, and I wanted to sort of create like a more beautiful living environment through urban planning. So that was sort of like my driving motivation throughout college. And last summer, I went to the state of Washington on an island, Lopez Island Community Land Trust, and I was a construction intern for them. It's my first time doing anything with my hands for like a summer. I just like found out about the CLT model and was fascinated, and also like, why aren't we doing this in cities, because it was a rural island. So when I came back to LA, I had to start thinking about my senior thesis, so I googled like community land trusts in Los Angeles, and I found the Los Angeles Eco Village, and I think it's very like easy to find once you look for it. And even the people that I've been interviewing, they said, oh yeah, I was looking for something related to permaculture or like affordable housing or this or that, and like there are many avenues to come here, but like it has to be sort of intentional. Like you have to know what you're looking for. So even though I grew up here, I didn't know about it until I developed an interest like all the way up in the Pacific Northwest. So I think I had a sort of year-long like environmentalist awakening the year before. Like my junior year of college, I took an anthropology of environmental justice class, which like sort of showed me that environmentalism didn't have to be blonde and white. When I came to the Eco Village, I was like, what? This is happening like in the middle of the city. Like these people are espousing the same values that I was so admiring on Lopez Island in the neighborhood that I grew up in. So running away from a problem, like from the social isolation that we talked about earlier, like I grew up in LA but only knew Koreatown, like I was in the ethnic enclave, ran away to boarding school and thought like, okay, I need to go like stay in better places. and then coming back and realizing there are strategies for regenerating or like sort of making the places that I think are like not as fun to live in like a better quality of life. So yeah, so I think the biggest draw for me about the LA Eco Village is that it was so close to home, yet espousing the exact same values that I've developed throughout college.
It was our plan to have a limited equity housing cooperative. It was our plan to have a community land trust and to separate the ownership of the housing from the ownership of the land. And then having really tight documents in the articles of incorporation and the bylaws and the policies. But what I also know is that no matter how good your documents were at protecting those kinds of things, the ultimate protection is the culture you build. And that is what took a bit longer than we anticipated. So having bought this building the one that we're in now, in 1996, CRISP bought it, the development organization. We did not sell it to our resident co-op until 2012 because it took that long to build the culture that my board felt secure, that overall people understood we are not doing this just for ourselves, affordable housing, but for future generations as well. And we wanted everyone to kind of really get that. And
there has been sort of a tension of like, okay, but there are people who have more expertise in this, and if we mess this up, we might lose this land. So that has been sort of like a tension between like, okay, we want to bring everyone on board, and we don't want to like ignore anybody's opinions, but there's also like the objective is to keep the land in the land trust. So it's still playing out, and I think like I just feel like people are generally reasonable, and we know when to say like, what about this ? Or like, I really feel like we should keep pursuing this like line of reasoning, and when to like sort of step back and like, okay, I think you have more experience on this than I do, so let's just go with your opinion on this. So far the Eco Village, I think, has been successful in demonstrating the fact that this community land trust model works. Like rent is only like 600 something in an area where rent is typically double that. So that's one success. Like another success is sort of developing the processes like of decision making. If you go to us two meetings, they're so much more structured, and like people are trained in facilitation, and people are like, there are processes that people follow. And I think like, I'm assuming that that's something that each community has to come to terms with, or like figure out like with that group of people, and figure out how to bring membership process. So like the formalization, the like pseudo like formalization and institutionalization, for the sake of transparency and for the sake of democracy, like has been established. Like even if Lois passes away tomorrow, this is going to continue on. So I think
we also have a local currency. The original local currency was the local exchange trading system, or LETS, which is happening in different parts of the world quite successfully. And that kind of had a good 10-year life, and then that kind of petered out. And for the last 10 years or so now, we've had the time bank. And so that's a very good local currency. It was important to have a local currency, and we have one. But we have a lot of informal exchange of goods and services as well within the intentional community. I would say one of the probably the backbone of everything was our ecological revolving loan fund. When we were thinking about, we're gonna need a lot of money to buy this building, at a certain point we just started growing our loan fund and reaching out to everyone we knew that might have money to loan to our loan fund. And we had very simple loan agreements. At one point, we had a 6-page loan agreement, which I wrote myself. Someone wanted to loan us $100,000, and they did not like our loan agreement, so they cut it down to a half a page. So that's what we've been using ever since. And anyone can find that a sample loan agreement and what our loan fund is all about, because we're still using it, on our website. You know, there are many different kinds of activities here. We have a food co-op we call the Food Lobby, because guess where it started? In the lobby of our big building. We have a tool shop that anyone can use. We have there are many bicycle activities that started here in LA Eco Village, which has been the center of bicycle culture in our city. So for example, the first bicycle kitchen, self-help bicycle repair started here. Now it's spread. There are bicycle pantries, bicycle ovens, and so forth around the city, around the country. We have an art studio, a sewing studio, and we have a 25-year plan. Some of the aspects of that plan are that are immediately in front of us is the redevelopment of the quarter-acre site immediately north of our large building in the north end of LA Eco Village, an old auto repair shop and an old cafe. The vision for that site is to create an eco co-op hostel. And also it will have several small businesses in that space, and it will have a cafe. It will have a mini public transportation museum in an old streetcar that we're going to bring back on the old streetcar tracks that are still publicly visible here in the neighborhood.
My drive comes from sort of like where I grew up, and like my mom, and like she's de facto a single parent, and like she says things like, oh, I wish I could just buy a big house, a mansion with like 5 of my closest friends, and that'll be my security for retirement, because she doesn't have a 401k, and she's experiencing the same like insecurities that I see reflected in like broader trends. And she espouses desire for the same kind of solutions that I'm studying. She just doesn't call it an eco-village or an intentional community. She just says like, that would be nice. And I'm just like, yes, that would be nice. And that's sort of what I'm trying to work on. And when I talk, like I also like run with Korean American seniors, sort of like got roped into like a Korean American running club. I'm like decades their junior, but because I've had these intergenerational friends, they say their minds are very much on retirement and how to die well and how to like prepare for that stage of their lives. And like my closest friend, I guess, he said something like, I never want to live in a senior living facility because like everyone's just there to wait and die, wait for death. And he said, I want to be around like young people, and I think like you should live in an eco village. So I like still need to work on like translating all of these concepts in like ways that are culturally like appropriate, because when I first described the eco village to them, it was like, oh, that's communism. And like South Korea has a very particular history with communism or socialism, like that kind of arrangement.
And you're studying about public policy and urban development and all this different stuff, and then getting involved with the LA Eco Village. So where do they come together?
Maybe philosophically, like the DIY urbanism that intentional communities espouse is not quite the same as like the politics of inclusion that like state bureaucrats tend to like go by. Like maybe there's like tension in that, but ultimately in terms of like raising the quality of life, like creating, like I've talked to like LA city planners like who talk about, yeah, we want to make this a more sustainable way of preserving affordable housing. We want to make alternative transportation like modes like equally as dignified as riding a car. Like what I hear from that is like everyone sort of like knows what is like a good society, what is like a good structure that facilitates good living. Like maybe there's like differences in opinion about like, okay, we need, like, these experts need to like give that to you, versus like we need to figure that out for ourselves. But for me, like, the interface is like in the outcomes, like, of like happier lives, like better lives for people. 99% of the housing stock in LA is not going to be new built housing. Like, so we need to figure out how to like create this like in like retrofitted areas, or like infill development areas. We can't like constantly like build new things. That's not sustainable either. So that was just, I don't have an engineering background, so I don't really know how the sustainability metrics like balance out. But philosophically speaking, in terms of like, okay, looking at a blighted neighborhood and being like, we don't have to like demolish it, we just need to work on it, because this was like bought as like in slum conditions. So and people keep telling me that. It's like, wow, I can't believe it. Intentionality isn't always comfortable, but it's always useful. Like, if you have like a certain goal, like, and maybe the goal is like power, like fixing power imbalances that often go like uninterrogated in like natural, like unintentional communities, or maybe the goal is like ecological living, and like you want to be intentional about that, and having like an explicit set of values, sort of like, guys, remember, like, we're an eco village, so we should be more intentional about this. I think that sort of happens without like legal incorporation as well, like just like in terms of culture. Like, when I was like a baby, like, I don't think environmentalism was as obvious of a thing as it is right now, because like among my friends at least, like, the climate change is a real thing, and we do need to do things about it. And like, using plastic water bottles, not so great. Like, using a reusable bottle is better. Like, this is like culture stuff, and I guess there could be a question of like whether that's intentional or not. But yeah, incorporating a little streams of intentionality into like unintentional communities, I think, like, you can't have, it can't be a binary.